Thanks.
We've got a lot to talk about in the banking sector, but let's pick up first of all on that EPA decision and the major questions doctrine and what it may indicate, not just about the EPA, but about other agencies that you're familiar with in Washington, and how far they can go with that explicit congressional authorization.
Yeah, so I think there's a very concerted effort by some on the left to try to achieve through the unelected and therefore unaccountable branches of government what they can't achieve through legislation. So whether it's the courts or it's regulators, we've seen this effort to affect policy. I see it in the Banking Committee, for instance, with the SEC. SEC attempting to impose this whole climate change disclosure regime that is completely divorced from financially material information that has historically been the guide for what has to be disclosed, and with no authority from Congress to do that. There was a major effort to have the Federal Reserve actually allocate capital away from the fossil fuel industry in order to accelerate a transition to a low-carbon economy. So I've been fighting this fight for quite some time because my argument is it shouldn't be about how quickly you think we ought to transition our economy. It's about who decides and who's accountable. In a democratic society, it has to be the people who are held accountable by the American people.
So, Senator, you know very well what the response is to that. You heard it, I'm sure, which is the following. There are a lot of things going on in this country. It's a very complicated country with a lot of important issues. Even in the opinions that we saw today, we had the majority admit that climate is a really tough issue. Congress has not shown its propensity to get a lot done very quickly. So effectively, that's saying we're not going to do anything about it. That's what the other side would say to what you said.
Yeah, well, they might say that. They would be ignoring what we did during 2020 and 2021 when we passed several $1 trillion worth of spending and new programs in direct response to the emergency of the moment, which was the lockdowns resulting from the pandemic. And they're really, that message, that idea is to basically another way of saying, you know, democracy doesn't really work. And so what we need to have is an omnipotent group of bureaucrats, and they'll be really smart, and they'll make all the decisions. That's not what America's about. And so, yeah, it's messy. You may not get the outcomes you prefer. You might have to wait longer than you'd like, but in the end, it's a democratic process that assures that the American people are actually sovereign. I think this idea that Congress isn't very effective, so let's just have a super legislative body, it's very offensive and deeply undemocratic.
So you mentioned before the Federal Reserve, something you've been very involved in. Obviously, we have an inflation problem. I think everybody can agree on that right now.
Yeah, I hope so.
And we heard actually from the U.S. central banker, the Fed Chair Jay Powell, yesterday, appearing over in Europe, about what they're going to do about inflation. This is part of what he had to say.
Strongly committed to using our tools to get inflation to come down. The way to do that is to slow down growth, ideally keep it positive, and as I mentioned, supply and demand get back into balance. So that's what we're trying to accomplish. Is there a risk that we would go too far? Certainly there's a risk. But I wouldn't agree that it's the biggest risk to the economy. I think that, you know, the bigger mistake to make, let's put it that way, would be to fail to restore price stability.
So, Senator, do you agree with the chair? I mean, you've not just been a senator. You've spent time on Wall Street. You know sort of the way the markets work at this point. Is the bigger risk right now recession or inflation?
Well, I think inflation's the bigger risk because it's here. It's real. And if inflation doesn't come under control quickly, it does enormous long-term damage. Is there a risk that we have a recession? Yes, I think clearly there's a significant risk that within the next 12 months we'll have a recession. My quarrel with the Fed and how it has managed monetary policy, and the reason we've gotten in this dilemma is because I think there's a mindset at the Fed that sees inflation as a psychological problem rather than a monetary problem. And by that I mean they are so focused on inflation expectations and not so much focused on the massive expansion in the money supply, the huge quantitative easing, the negative real interest rates, which persist to this day. Those things, I think, are what almost assured us that combined with massive overspending that was then financed by debt that was monetized by the Fed, this is a recipe for inflation. And I think the Fed gets it, that there's a problem. And they're going to move aggressively, I think, but I'm still not convinced that they view this in the optimal sort of framework.
There's a substantive set of issues here. Process also matters, and you've been outspoken about the process surrounding the Fed right now, the possible reform that you think is appropriate. It came out of actually Sarah Bloom Raskin's confirmation hearing, I recall. What would you do if you had your druthers about regulatory reform for the Fed and its operation?
Well, we're wrestling with that because we have the situation where the Fed is basically stonewalling Congress. The regional banks, and to some extent the main Fed, are taking the position that what we do is none of your business. We're an independent agency. You can't really look very closely on what we do. That's outrageous, right? The Fed exists as a creature of Congress, right? We delegate to the Fed the constitutional authority to control the supply of money that the Constitution gives to us. But in the case, for instance, of the Kansas City Fed, first turning down, then approving, then repealing, apparently, master accounts for Reserve Trust, a fintech company based in Colorado, we've simply said, hey, could explain to us the methodology here, and we're getting stonewalled. The answer is no, none of your business. They're taking the position that they're not accountable to anyone, and that's not acceptable. So there's a few things we could do. We could have more Fed officials subject to Senate confirmation.
Like the regional presidents, for example?
For instance, yes. We could do that. We could subject them to FOIA, which they're not subject to now. We could have a consolidation of the regional banks. You know, the regional banks are really an artifact of a time when the money supply was managed separately among the various regions. So there's a lot we could do. Bottom line is they've got to be more transparent and accountable.
But I know that you respect and really value the independence of the Fed. We need an independent central bank. Where does the line exist between transparency on the one hand and regulation on the other? You can easily lapse from one over into the other.
Well, sure. I mean, the independence that we generally focus on is the independence to set monetary policy, because we worry that political pressure will always be there to have ultra easy money, and that is destructive over the long haul. And I get that, and I'm sympathetic to that argument. When we're talking about the issuance of a master account, that's a very valuable public good. It's the ability to conduct monetary transactions directly with the Fed. Every fintech in America would love to have it. Virtually none of them do. How the Fed goes about issuing those, that's something that Congress ought to have some say in. We ought to at least have some oversight on.
Finally, let me ask you one political question, if I may. You've been outspoken about what happened in January 6th. Putting aside what you're hearing in the hearings right now, do you think that this effectively means that Donald J. Trump won't get to run for a second term?
Oh, I don't know that it means that. I mean, he gets to decide whether he's going to run, whether or not he's successful. Look, I think he disqualified himself from serving in public office by virtue of his post-election behavior, especially leading right up to January 6th. I think the revelations from this committee make his path to even the Republican nomination much more tenuous. You know, never say never, and he decides whether to throw his hat in the ring. But I think we'll have a stronger candidate.